Hello, my name is Kiran Joni. This is the fifth in the introduction series of the Eso-Loop Framework. Until now, we were looking at the problem of entrepreneurial complexity and the weakness of contemporary thinking space. In this session, we will be briefly covering the solution space. This is not a detailed introduction. In this session, I will be briefly touching the structure of the solution space. That's all. The first thing first, the entire framework is built on the core theoretical foundation of self-organization. That is, open complex adaptive systems like entrepreneurship have a tendency to self-organize under various constraints. Now, if self-organization happens under various constraints, this begs the question, can we design for self-organization? Can we design in various constraints to a complex system so as to affect dynamics of self-organization? This points to the designability of self-organizing systems. According to Carlos Christensen, designing for self-organization can be very useful in complex systems where the observer cannot a priori conceive of all possible configurations, purposes, or problems that the system may be confronted with. Examples of these are organizations, traffic control, distributed robotics, allocation of ecological resources, self-assembling nanotubes, and complex software systems such as the internet. This points to the fact that self-organization and design are complementary pairs. This fact was reiterated by a recent work co-authored by Scott Kelso and Portugali also. So this is the theoretical foundation over which the Eso-Loop framework is built on. That is, self-organization happens under various constraints, and by changing, introducing, manipulating, or designing in various constraints into a self-organizing system, we can affect self-organization direction and dynamics. This effect can be positive or negative. The Eso-Loop framework was built over this theoretical foundation. The framework has three key components. Note that the term component here is not used to indicate separation of any kind. It is just used here as an instrument to introduce three dimensions of an inseparable, entangled system. It is thus important to view the entire dynamics of the framework as a single system, not having parts at all. So it's a dynamical system, it's an entangled system. That's a key point to remember. Now, the Eso-Loop framework has three important components. The first key component is complex ecological worldview. Here, a complexity-based ecological worldview is introduced. It is important to have the right worldview before we try to design solutions. So this is one of the most foundational aspects of this framework, because if we start with a reductive linear worldview, the design solution will reflect that weakness. The complex ecological worldview is contrasted with other possible worldviews to give more clarity on what I mean by complex ecological worldview. I contrast it with single model worldview, multiple model ensembles, cognitive diversity view, and holistic diversity view. I contrast this with the ecological worldview, which is a complexity-based worldview. It's an interconnected and entangled worldview. It assumes that every complex systems are connected with other complex systems. They are exchanging energy and information with each other. That's the first component of the framework. The second and third component are the real dynamical aspect of the framework. Second component is about the idea of effectual self-organization, a primary enabling constraint, or you can call it simple rules or heuristics for entrepreneurs to deliberately act like self-organizing systems. Now, the first key primary constraint is act like self-organizing system. That is a primary constraint. Then there is a list of simple heuristics, including understanding your current dispositional propensity, acting in the adjacent possible, make use of the coevolutionary potential of other systems, leverage emergent reality. I'm not going to go to detail of these individual constraints because I plan to dedicate an entire session for effectual self-organization. So what are we saying here? Entrepreneurs, as a primary constraint, should act like self-organizing system. They shouldn't be acting like what lean startup prescribes or business planning prescribes. They should deliberately act like self-organizing system. They shouldn't be allowing external agents to hijack their agency. Because this is grounded in complexity theory, its applicability is extremely valid. This is the core idea. The third key component is constraints and the role of constraints in shaping self-organization. Here, I use constraints-based design, an idea inspired from the constraints-led approach in sports coaching, to design and introduce various enabling constraints that can shape entrepreneurial self-organization and exploration. Here, Alicia Herrera's conception of context-sensitive and context-free constraints is used as a fundamental frame over which various constraints are introduced. So in the framework, we introduce two types of constraints that is taken from Alicia Herrera's idea. Context-free constraints and context-sensitive constraints are there. Now, context-free constraints are like genetics. It comes before the context comes into being. Context-sensitive constraints are part of the dynamics itself. It only kicks in when the dynamics of the self-organization happens. It is part of the self-organizing dynamics. So, for example, business planning, lean startup, having clear goals, intention, value proposition, vision statement, all of these are context-free constraints. They have nothing to do with context beforehand. Only after the context come into being, then the application of these ideas will be manifested through context-sensitive constraints. For example, a sales happening in the context. So this is context-sensitive constraint. Now, as a final design, the framework looks like this. The entrepreneurs in the middle have the worldview, complex ecological worldview. They act like self-organizing systems using the effectual self-organization framework. And over this, various context-free constraints and context-sensitive constraints are introduced. This definitely need a lot of explanation. I will be dedicating separate session for this purpose, but I'm not going to spend much time in this session doing that. So in this session, I was giving an overview of the Eso-Loop framework. First of all, I touched the theoretical foundation over which the Eso-Loop framework is built on. Then I introduced three core components of the framework. The first component is a complex ecological worldview. The second component is the primary constraint or effectual self-organization, which is a collection of simple, flexible heuristics that is intended to enable the entrepreneurs to act like self-organizing systems. The third component, constraints, I used Alicia Herrera's conception of context-sensitive and context-free constraints to introduce various enabling constraints. The dynamics of these constraints and also the dynamics of effectual self-organization will be discussed in upcoming sessions, which I plan to dedicate for that. Anyway, I'm stopping this introduction session here. In the upcoming sessions, I will introduce you to the Eso-Loop framework in its dynamics, where I'll be explaining the practical aspects of the Eso-Loop framework. So that's the end of this session. See you soon in the next one.